Open your Bibles with me to Genesis chapter 37. As you can see what I've got up there on the wall, I guess, not the screen, the wall, we're going to be covering quite a lot of text this evening. We're certainly not going to read all of that, so don't get too terrified. But we are going to jump around and we'll read several verses here and a verse or two there, and we're going to follow the story of Joseph, pretty much from its beginning to its end. And I'd like to start by looking at his beginnings, and then not quite the end, but we'll see an enormous change in the life of Joseph. So in Genesis 37, let's start by just reading verse 28. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. They took Joseph to Egypt. Well, that doesn't sound like things are going particularly well for him, does it? Jump forward and let's read verse 36. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Still, not looking so good for him in the course of his life. Jump forward a few chapters to chapter 41, and let's read verses 40 through 43. Pharaoh says to Joseph, "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Okay, so we saw how this started for Joseph, and then what an enormous change has taken place just a few chapters later. How did this happen? That seems like an unlikely course for events to take, and I don't know about you, but if I didn't know this story before, and all I had was that as the start point and this as the end point, I would really be curious to know what happened in between. What made that possible? For him to go from being a slave to being in charge of Egypt. It's a little bit reminiscent of the familiar success stories that we all know, the kind of legendary rags to riches tale. We might call it the American dream today in our culture. So maybe it was something like that. Maybe it was just constant work and those tiny little rewards slowly building up until he finally got where he wanted to be. Or maybe he took an approach with less integrity, and he begged and borrowed and stole his way to the top. Maybe it's a story of ambition winning out over the poor circumstances. No, it's neither of those. And it's not really any of the other likely scenarios that you might care to insert here to explain this course of events. None of this applies to Joseph. Let's look through and see what we can learn from Joseph's success story. And I hope learn how to find our own success. Let's back up to chapter 37. And we'll start in the middle of verse 2. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him, and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. We don't tend to present this story to our kids in this way, but when we really think about it, honestly, it seems pretty clear that Joseph started out as a spoiled rich kid. We don't see a whole lot of indication that he has a sterling character here. Now, we don't see him going out and just rampantly sinning right and left, but we do see that his behavior is maybe not what we would have wanted. He's a tattletale, first of all. He brings a bad report of his brothers to their father. Now, I'm sure they had it coming, just like every other kid when there was a tattletale. But we still don't think very highly of the tattletale, do we? Well, that's what Joseph was doing. And then he starts having these dreams, and he starts sharing them with his brothers. Now, maybe we could give him a pass on the first one. Maybe. Now, I would say that's even a stretch. He has this dream. He says, "Look, we were out in the field. We were gathering our grain, and I had my sheep, and then all of yours, for some reason, came, and they bowed down to mine. And I don't know what in the world it means." Well, obviously, it's very clear what it means, and all of his brothers can immediately tell what it means, and they assume that he knows what it means, and that's why they're mad at him. Because he had the dream, and also because, having had the dream, he goes and shares it with them. Like, "Hey, you know what I saw in my dream? That might be the kind of thing, Joseph, that you keep to yourself." But he shares it with them, and they don't like it. As I said, even if we give him a pass on that one and just say, maybe he didn't realize what that was going to look like. Well, he has another dream. It's basically the same thing, except it adds dad and mom into it this time. And he goes and shares it again, as if he expects a different result this time. Now, it's not clear that he's sort of lording it over his brothers, and especially not his father and mother here, and saying, "You know what? I'm really going to be hot stuff one day." But it certainly kind of leaves that impression, and it doesn't leave us a whole lot of room to go anywhere else with this. A spoiled rich kid. And unsurprisingly, he's a little bit resented for this. No big surprises so far. Usually, in a situation like this where there's one person who's resented by the rest of the family is going to act out their resentment with small acts of spite. That's usually what we would see. But what actually happens, as we read a little bit earlier, in the verses 12 through 36, they sell their brother into slavery. That's not a small act of spite. I think we would probably all agree in saying that's pretty major. I think this suggests that Joseph was an exceedingly annoying 17-year-old. To illustrate this point, think about if you have them your own younger siblings. I have 2 younger sisters myself. I sometimes resented them. I sometimes felt like they were being treated with more favor than I had been shown. Occasionally, I thought I'd like to beat them senseless for something they had done or said. But I never seriously considered killing them. It's probably the same for most of you that have had younger siblings. But 8 or 9, it's not entirely clear, of the 10 brothers present here are actually ready to kill Joseph when this occurs. I say 8 or 9 because young Benjamin is almost certainly at home. He's even younger than Joseph, and Joseph was even at home, and he's sent out to go and check on his brothers. So Benjamin's almost certainly at home, so let's say there's only 10 of his brothers present. Reuben, in this instance, he provides a slightly more responsible perspective and says, hold on. Maybe killing him isn't the best thing for us to do, so we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. We'll move him out and say that 9 of the brothers are ready to kill him. And we've also got Judah to deal with. And Judah, he's the one who, remember, says, well, maybe we could sell him to these people. It's possible that he's trying to save Joseph's life and just thinks, look, unless I come up with a better alternative, they're going to kill him. I don't want them to kill him, so I'll suggest this, and that will at least save his life. It's possible that's what he's saying or what he's thinking, and I'd like to just give him the benefit of the doubt on that. But we should also consider the possibility that he's just really greedy and doesn't really care anything for Joseph and just figures this is a way to make a quick buck. while getting rid of Joseph at the same time. Still, even if he's trying to save his life, that's 8 out of 10 brothers that are thinking, kill Joseph? Yeah, that seems like a reasonable conclusion for us to reach. Okay, well, they don't. They are swayed by Judah's advice, and so they just sell him into slavery. Now, again, I never got anywhere near that point with my siblings. And let me further illustrate this. Illustrate just how extreme and ridiculous this is for them. Joseph's brothers are not impulsive teenagers. They're not a bunch of kids that aren't really thinking about what they're doing. They're grown men. We don't know their exact ages, but Joseph is, as we read, he is the son of Jacob's old age, and he's 17. I think that suggests very strongly that most of his brothers are significantly older than he is. Reuben's probably over 30. And it makes sense to all of them to either kill him or sell him into slavery. These are not the acts of impulsive adolescents. They're grown men. And they think this makes sense. Okay, well, they do sell him into slavery. And by chapter 39, Joseph's situation actually improves a little bit. He goes from being a prisoner in that pit to being a slave, of course, but then he goes from there to be an important slave. So that's something, at least. It's not ideal, certainly not where Joseph saw his life going. Remember those dreams that he had? He had pretty clear expectations, but it seems like maybe it's starting to work out in a way that is somewhat palatable for him. Until, of course, just when it seems like Joseph has hit on a somewhat pleasant and stable life for himself, his master's wife steps in to ruin it for everyone. And where does he end up? Back in the pit. Chapter 39, verse 20. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Now, we can add insult to injury in what's happened to Joseph here. Back up a little bit, chapter 39, verse 1. Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. So he is a slave to Potiphar, who is the captain of the guard. Okay, the prison was clearly in Potiphar's house. We just read about that. We will read about that in a second. Chapter 40, verse 3. He put him in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. So now we know exactly where this prison is. It's in Potiphar's house. So now Joseph is being confined in the same house, or maybe the same complex, if we can give it a little bit more credit, where his owner lives, the same house that he used to manage. And he's been put in the prison there unjustly. Now, you heard me a moment ago refer to that prison as a pit. Joseph himself refers to it that way in chapter 40, verse 15. He's talking to the the baker or the cupbearer here. I think it's the cupbearer. And he says, "For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." We're not really given any indication that the prison here actually is like dug out from the ground. That seems like pretty unnecessary excavation for them to do. But regardless, that's the way Joseph looks at it. He frames it as a pit. It's almost as if he is reliving that experience from when he was a kid back in the land of Canaan, when his brothers unjustly threw him into this pit. He's seeing this as a replaying of those same events. Here I was minding my own business. I didn't do anything to deserve it, and they threw me in here. And now I'm stuck, and I can't do anything to get myself out. Seems like he's back where he came from then. But that's not where the story ends. There's a big change that comes when Pharaoh has a dream. Now, we've already seen Joseph have a couple of dreams, and he didn't clearly interpret them, but it seemed pretty obvious what they meant to him and to everybody else. Now Pharaoh's having dreams. We saw, we didn't read this, but he had interpreted the dreams from the cupbearer, or sometimes it's translated the butler, and the baker of Pharaoh as well. He had interpreted their dreams correctly, and now he gets his chance. Pharaoh has a dream. No one else can interpret it for him. Joseph provides that. By this time, Joseph has been a slave and a prisoner for a combined 13 years. And when Joseph speaks to Pharaoh, he is put into a hugely privileged position. We've already read this, but let's read it again. Chapter 41, verses 40 through 43. You shall be over my house. Excuse me. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about its neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, Bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. So, I ask the question, why? Why did Pharaoh do this? Why did Pharaoh take a prisoner, a slave, supposedly a rapist, who had treated his previous master with the utmost contempt, and make that guy second in command of the greatest empire on earth at the time? Why would he do that? Well, we can see a little bit of the answer if we just back up a couple of verses. Chapter 41, verses 38 and 39. And Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. This small interaction that Pharaoh has with Joseph shows him something so important about Joseph that he is willing to take an enormous bet out on him and say, I'm putting you in charge. I want you to handle this situation. But what was it? What was it that made him see that the Spirit of God was in him? What was it that made him see that he was so wise and discerning? Well, certainly interpreting the dream, that's something, but how does he know that that's accurate? How does he know that the interpretation is actually going to come true? So there's got to be a little bit more to it. Again, if we just back up a few verses, we'll start to understand a little bit. Let me preface this by reminding you, if you don't remember already, the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams is that Egypt was going to have 7 years of abundance, where all the crops were going to be plentiful, and then that they were going to have 7 years of famine that would follow on those 7 years of plenty. Okay, so that's what Joseph tells Pharaoh is going to happen, but he goes one better. He doesn't just provide the interpretation. That's what he was asked to do. He gives the interpretation, and then let's read verses 33 through 36. Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. It's a pretty good plan, isn't it? That's why Pharaoh says, well, he said I should appoint a wise and discerning man. Seems to be a pretty wise and discerning fellow himself. And he's given me this interpretation that sounds quite reasonable. He's got a plan for how to fix it. And it's a good plan. But I'm going to keep asking why. Why does he believe it? How does Pharaoh, how does even Joseph know that this plan will work? How does he know that Pharaoh can pull it off? How does he know what resources Pharaoh actually has at his disposal? He's been in prison for the last who knows how long. It's not exactly like he's got Fox News streaming in. How does he know that Pharaoh can pull this off? How does he know what methods and actions will work efficiently in practice, not just in theory? It's one thing to sit down and say, well, the numbers all check out, and if we were to do this, then it should work out this way. Well, I mean, in theory, but what about in practice? That's where the rubber meets the road, and that doesn't always line up with the theory. How does Joseph know that it'll work? Think for a moment about the logistics involved in what Joseph is proposing. We're just going to scratch the surface, but think about, for instance, how long grain will keep. We don't even know exactly what type of grain we're talking about. How does he know that it'll keep long enough? Because if you store up a bunch of grain in hopes that, 7 years down the road you'll be able to break into that store and it goes bad, then oops, now we've made things worse for ourselves. Yet Joseph seems to have complete command of all of these details. How does he know exactly how much grain will be needed? Think about that for a moment. You notice he doesn't say save half. That's what I would say, just off the cuff. I would say, well, if you're going to have plenty, and you're going to have 7 years where there's plenty, and then there's 7 years where there's pretty much nothing, then, well, if you save half from the years of plenty, then that'll certainly cover the 7 years where you have nothing. But he doesn't say half; he says a fifth. Well, that's not going to work as well, is it? You're still going to be running pretty lean on those other 7 years, aren't you? How is that going to be enough? And yet that's the plan that he puts forth, and it's going to be borne out in the implementation of it. It works. Somehow he knows that will work just fine. How does he know and understand the economics involved? Like how much can actually be taken from the people of the kingdom without causing an undue hardship, which is exactly what they're trying to avoid. How does he know that? How does he know that he's not going to make it worse for them in the first 7 years where they have plenty than it would have been if he had just left things alone and the 7 years of famine came? How does he know? How does he know that he can implement this 20% tax, flat tax, and a whole bunch of government buying? He doesn't mention this here, but when we see him implement the plan, that's clearly part of it. How does he know that all those things, with some frugal measures elsewhere, is going to lead to the kind of huge reserve and the strong economy that he wants? How does he know? Now, we might say he doesn't. He's just making stuff up. But in practice, he proves that Pharaoh was right to choose him. Pharaoh won his bet. In chapter 41, let's read verses 46 through 49. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years the earth produced abundantly, and he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. How far did I want to go? Verse 49. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance like the sand of the sea until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Let's jump down and read verses 53 through 57 as well. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened up all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. Let's jump forward several chapters, chapter 47, and we'll read verses 13 through 26 there. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain that they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my Lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my Lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh. And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made servants of them from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones. And they said, You have saved our lives. May it please my Lord, we will be servants to Pharaoh. So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. Joseph has not only saved the lives of millions of people in Egypt and elsewhere, but he has also saved the economic and political stability of Egypt and thereby the entire region by consolidating all of the power under Pharaoh. He has monopolized the most important resources and the labor. He has provided for stability in the future as well. He has turned Pharaoh from being king and more or less in charge to being an absolute ruler and the owner of the land of Egypt and the people of Egypt. And at the end of all of that, you would think he would have made some enemies. At the end of all of that, they thank him for doing so. This guy is an inexperienced shepherd from Canaan. How in the world does he accomplish this? How does he plan and execute those plans like the Grand Master? Where did he get all of the knowledge and wisdom necessary for this to work? Now there's an easy answer that people are often inclined to give. Just say, well, God told him. And the text doesn't tell us that. It doesn't give us any evidence of that. But in a manner of speaking, I think that's exactly what happened. I don't think that God came to him in a dream necessarily and told him this is what you should do. I don't think that he was just speaking directly into Joseph's mind. He might have been, and we're just not told. But it's not necessary for us to go to that length to explain why Joseph is able to do this. Let's back up again. Chapter 39. What was Joseph's job when he was in Potiphar's house? You remember? We touched on it briefly, but we never really covered it in detail. Let's read verses 4 through the beginning of verse 6. So Joseph found favor in his sight, that's Potiphar, and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. That was his job in Potiphar's house. How was Joseph put to work in prison? Because that's what they did in prisons. It's not like a lot of prisons in this country today where it's basically the Ritz-Carlton, and you just get to sit around and watch TV most of the time. They were put to work because they're mouths to feed, and it's an empty resource, or it's an empty liability, and we need to turn it into a resource. So let's put him to work. Well, what was his job? Chapter 39, verses 21 through 23. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. How long did all that take? Do you remember? It took 13 years. Because we mentioned earlier he was 17 years old when he was sold, and we read that he was 30 years old when he was put in charge of Egypt. So it took 13 years. How long would his management of Egypt be needed? 7 years of plenty, 7 years of nothing, 14 years. Pretty much the same period. Isn't that interesting? God was preparing him for that task. In Potiphar's house, Joseph learned how to effectively manage great wealth and great authority. In Potiphar's prison, Joseph learned how to effectively manage great lack. Now, we're not told specifically about this, but when's the last time you heard of a prison that wasn't underfunded? I don't think there ever has been one. We try to put as little as we possibly can into that. And I'm sure that's what Joseph was dealing with. And we're not told this either, but given the fact that it was 13 years, I suspect he spent roughly at least equal time in each job, managing Potiphar's house and managing Potiphar's prison. And so when he was confronted by the same things on a national, even international scale, he knew how to handle it better than anyone else around because he had done it before, because God had put him in those situations and been with him to help him and to give him that experience and to teach him how to do that job well. I called him inexperienced before. It wasn't true. He was very experienced. He was very successful. God prepared Joseph for 13 years to carry out this task, which would save multiple nations, including his own father's house. So, was it worth it, do you think, to Joseph? Because those 13 years, I'm sure, were pretty miserable. What was gained from it in the end for Joseph? Go forward all the way to Genesis chapter 50. This is years afterward. It's all said and done. And they're looking back on those events now. Genesis chapter 50, we'll start in verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. Joseph definitely thought it was worth it. Joseph didn't consider that it had been unjust in the end. Joseph was able to see God's plan in it. And to say, "Yes, I know, brothers, you were trying to hurt me. Yes, what you did was wrong and you shouldn't have done it. But I'm not mad at you. I'm not mad about it at all. Because even though you were trying to hurt me, God was behind it. And he intended for good to come from it. And it did. And I was able to save you as a result." It was worth it for Joseph. Is it worth it for you? Has this kind of thing ever happened to you? Is it maybe going on right now? I hope it is, one way or another. Because God hasn't just left us down here to do as well as we can with whatever brand of chaos we inherit. He has plans. We don't know what a lot of those plans are in great detail. We don't know what tomorrow has in store for us. We don't even know that we can expect a tomorrow. But God does. God has plans, and don't you think that those plans are going to involve you and me? We're probably going to play minor roles and not be a Joseph, but we're still involved. What potential do you have in God's plans, in God's kingdom? What great responsibilities could you fulfill? What wonderful things might you accomplish with God to help you? For the most part, all those things that we might accomplish or fulfill, we can't do them by pure instinct. We can't do them all of our own accord. It takes some help, and it takes a lot of work. It requires us to learn. Compare this to every job you've ever had. The jobs that pay better, the ones that have better rewards, they require more training. They require more knowledge, more skill, more education. And the getting of all of the knowledge and skill and education and training feels like suffering most of the time when you're going through it. But we consider that suffering to be worth it for the rewards that are coming. When things don't seem to be going very well in your life, when circumstances are stacked against you, when you feel like you can't catch a break, how do you know that it's not because God is trying to prepare you for something much bigger and better later on? We generally like to complain and to highlight our suffering and pain. But if we just leave it at that and never think of anything else, then we won't be prepared for whatever it is God has in store for us. I encourage you, learn to overcome. Now, you can't do it all alone. Just like with Joseph. Now, he needed God not only to put him into the right circumstances, he needed God with him every step of the way. He needed God even to show him what are the meaning of these dreams. Well, we need God too. But through his Son, through our Savior, we can overcome the challenges in our paths. Accept his teaching and his discipline with a good heart and be ready for what awaits. Joseph is still remembered for his success in Egypt. He was able to preserve his family so that God could fulfill the promises that he had made in turn to Abraham. Joseph, in a small way, enabled the Christ's coming, enabled our salvation. Wouldn't you like to have a legacy like that? To have that small part in assisting and enabling God's great works? That's a whole new kind of success. That's not financial, monetary, and houses and lands and that kind of thing. That's something better than wealth and honor and power. It's something that lasts forever. It's a lot more important. Now, Joseph, as he was searching for this kind of success, he went through a pattern where he started out wealthy and he ended up destitute. He did that 3 times that we know of, at least. The first one was when he was at home. He was the spoiled rich kid, right? He was ruling the roost as far as he was concerned. And then from there he went to being thrown into a pit and becoming a slave. Well, the second time through, he starts as the highest of Potiphar's servants, and then he gets thrown into the pit again, back where he was. The third time was the big payoff, of course, where he went from national abundance, but then he also had to deal with a great famine. The first time that he went through this pattern of wealth and dearth, you might say, he didn't handle it all that well. He rubbed his privilege in his brothers' faces, and then when he was in the pit and helpless, he was begging because he couldn't do anything of his own accord. That's what I believe it's Reuben says he did in chapter 42, verse 21. He begged them. Now the second time, it was a whole lot more consequential, a whole lot more severe, and he learned to do it very well. He ascended to the top spot in Potiphar's household and then to the top spot in Potiphar's prison, and he learned how to manage those resources and to handle problems by himself and to plan and to take care of the people around him. But the third time was when it really mattered for him and for everyone else. He spent the fat years working hard and treating it almost as if it were a famine and saving up for later. And then he spent the lean years feeding entire nations and profiting immensely for Pharaoh and for his own family. And this time, in contrast to those other two occasions, when the bottom fell out and he was left with nothing, he didn't lose his clothes. That happened the first time. He lost his coat. Happened the second time. Potiphar's wife took his garment from him. Didn't happen the third time. He learned. And when it really mattered, when God's enormous plans were being realized, Joseph was prepared to handle the situation. Will we respond like Joseph did? Often life is difficult, both in the physical realm and in the spiritual realm. But instead of pitying ourselves and complaining and wallowing in misery, let's follow the example that we've seen tonight in Joseph. Let's learn how to thrive in any circumstances and be ready for whatever work it is that he is preparing us to do in his kingdom. And finally, I should mention, none of this means anything to you if you're not a part of the kingdom. Think about Joseph's family back in Canaan. In the absence of God's plan being fulfilled, what hope did they have? They would have starved to death. But God had a plan. Joseph serves as a type of Christ in this story. He put Joseph in the right place at the right time to make sacrifices, to suffer unjustly, and to conquer and reign so that he could in turn bless them. That's what God has done with his son and us. We, just like Joseph's family, would be absolutely hopeless. But he sent his son. He sent his son to suffer unjustly, to work, to conquer, to reign, and to offer us salvation. Now Joseph's brothers might have been inclined to say, oh, we don't want his help because look at the way that he treated us all that way back when. How silly would that have been? Just as ridiculous as it would have been for them to reject his help, it's ridiculous to reject the offer of salvation through Christ that God is making us. If you need that salvation, please take care of that tonight as we stand and sing.
Stand up for Jesus, ye soldiers of the cross. Lift high his royal banner, it must not suffer loss. From victory unto victory, his army shall he lead, till every foe is vanquished, and Christ is Lord indeed. Stand up for Jesus, the trumpet call obey. For to the mighty conflict in this his glorious day, ye that are men now serve him against a numbered foe. Let courage rise with danger, and strength to strength oppose. Stand up for Jesus, the strife will not be long. This day the noise of battle, the next the victor's song. To him that overcometh, a crown of life shall be. He with the King of glory shall reign eternally. good to see everyone out tonight. We want to thank Jeremy and his family for coming and spending time with us. I know I don't have any other announcements. Is there anybody else? EJ? Okay. You want? You sing another song?
I'm not ashamed. I'll come up here and say,